The Starchild's story begins in Mexico, about 100 miles southwest of Chihuahua, near the Copper Canyon area, not in it, but near it. It's a high desert area, like northern Arizona around the Grand Canyon or something like that. In about 1930, a family of Mexican heritage was returning to their home village for the first time in a number of years. They had several children, I think the oldest of whom was a girl about 13, 14, 15. In later life, she couldn't remember exactly how old she was, but she was in her teens. And when they arrived in this small village, the children were told, they were all told, that in the area they couldn't go in the caves or the mine tunnels, the old abandoned mine tunnels, because it was unsafe and it was just taboo and don't do it. So the girl decided that she wanted to explore and see what that was all about. So a few days later, she took a basket under the excuse of going out to look for some fruits or berries, and she was just going to go exploring, and she did, and she went a considerable distance away from the village and found a mine tunnel up an arroyo. She saw a mine tunnel, and she went up and she climbed up into it. And when she walked into that mine tunnel, some distance in, maybe 50 feet, where she could still see what she could see, she found a human skeleton lying on its back, looking up, on the dirt, just an exposed human skeleton. And she got a little closer, and she saw that beside it was a mounded up pile of dirt from the floor that looked like a grave. And a little closer still, she noticed that coming out of that grave was what she called a misshapen hand. That was the word she chose, a misshapen hand. We don't really know what that meant. But that hand, she said, was wrapped around the upper arm bone of the human lying on the dirt. So that's a very dramatic scene, which meant, although she didn't understand it at the time, but it meant that the individual that was in the grave had died, and the individual lying on the dirt had buried it and left its hand sticking out. And to signify the closeness of their relationship, she wrapped it around her own arm, and then she laid there and died. She committed suicide in some way. We don't really know how, but there's no other way to account for that scene as the girl described it than what I've just said. So either romantic or dramatic or both, we don't really know. What the girl couldn't know, what we later found out, was that they had been lying there for 900 years. That was a 900-year-old burial. So it was quite special that she had managed to find it. Her first reaction was that it was the grave looked like it had not been compacted. The dirt looked fairly loose, and she assumed that if she just scraped the dirt away, she would find the other skeleton. And so she did that. She decided to dig it up, and she did. And she said that she found that the skeleton in the grave had a misshapen body. She said the word was that the whole skeleton was misshapen, like the hand. What that means, again, we don't really know. That was her word. And she said it was noticeably smaller than the other one. Now, based on the size of the head of the skull that she ultimately recovered, we know that the one lying on the ground was about 5 feet tall. Not uncommon for Mexicans to this day. So we assume that the one in the grave, since it was noticeably smaller, was in the range of 4 feet. These are just assumptions that we make. So she decided that because all the bones were there, and she had a basket, she was going to recover the skeletons and take them, try to sneak them back into the States, maybe donate them to her school as exhibits. She assumed the misshapen one was just a deformity of some kind. She was just a kid. She wouldn't know any better. There was certainly no, UFOs or aliens in 1930, so it wouldn't have entered her mind to think anything but deformity. So she didn't have a plan for doing that, for sneaking them back in. So her first thought was, I have to hide these somewhere nearer to the village so that I can figure out a way to do this and then come back and get the bones and do it. So on the way back, she found a ravine coming down from an arroyo, kind of a ravine, and it has some trees and bushes on it, along it, and there was a tree and there was a shelf underneath that tree of a hollowed out area under the roots where she felt she could hide them very safely, and all of them, and they would be completely out of sight, a really good hiding place, which she did. And she was then going to come back once she figured out what to do with them. Well, that very night came a torrential rainstorm that lasted all that night, all the next day, all the next night, and then stopped. And so when she was able to go out to look to see if the bones were okay, what she found was that in the heavy rains, the arroyo had filled up. The flow of water that had undercut the roots to begin with had washed away all of the bones, gone, clean. And so she was, of course, upset, and she walked downstream and she found some bushes at the side, and they had snagged both skulls and the upper piece of maxilla of the misshapen skull, and she was able to recover that, the two skulls and the piece of maxilla, the detached piece of maxilla, and that was it. Both skulls had now suffered some damage in their tumble down the stream in the torrent that came down with the rocks and limbs and whatever else was in there. The human had lost one of its zygomatic arches, broken that off, and that's a pretty heavy bone, so it was a pretty good lick, whatever knocked it off. And the misshapen one had lost its lower face completely, and both of its zygomatic arches, both of its cheekbones, and it had lost a part under its neck called the basilar part. We don't know if that fell off because it wasn't fully detached, or if it was knocked off. We don't really know. But nonetheless, she was happy to have the two skulls. She considered that something, at least, and it was much easier to solve the problem of trying to sneak them back, two whole skeletons. So she kept the two skulls. Later in life, a few years later, she had them shellacked as a preservative, which was a common preservative in the 30s, which was a good thing because it really did protect the skulls from having the oils of hands seep into the bones. And then she put them in a cardboard box, basically, and put them in her garage and more or less just forgot about them. But she kept them for the course of her life, and in the early 90s, she found out that she had a terminal illness and was going to die. So when that happened, she wanted to find a home for them with somebody somewhere. And she had some friends, and she asked them if they would take her, what she considered souvenirs at that time. Would she keep her souvenirs, her skulls that she had? And they said, yeah, sure. What are you going to say to a dying woman? Yeah, sure, we'll do that, no problem. Well, then she died, and they kept them, that couple kept them for 5 years in their garage as well, in the same box. So after, they were never quite that easy with them, and they met a couple named Ray and Melanie Young from El Paso. All these people are from El Paso, Texas, in the States. And Ray and Melanie, it turned out, were an interesting choice because Melanie had, for 15 years, had been a neonatal nurse, and she had dealt with a lot of human deformity in those years, as anybody would. So human deformity, as she understood it, was not displayed by the unusual skull. And when she felt it, she could feel immediately that it was way too light. She could look at it and see that its parts were very, very different from a normal human skull, even a deformed human skull. And the symmetry, it was much too symmetrical, very, very different, but much too symmetrical to be any kind of a deformity that she was aware of. But on top of that, she and Ray both were members of El Paso MUFON, which is the Mutual UFO Network. And being members of that, they knew a lot about aliens and what aliens were supposed to look like. So she said to Ray, this looks like it could easily be the head of a gray skull because it has all the hallmarks of a gray, including, as you see, a crease in the top of the head that humans don't have. Humans just are rounded in that area. And grays are said to have a heart-shaped face with a little bit of a groove here, a roundness here on each side, which you have with these expanded parietals, and then a very, very reduced lower face. And in fact, this has all the hallmarks of a very reduced lower face. It physically looks like it could be a skull that would fit in a gray alien, the standard image that we have of a gray alien. So she said, I want to have this thing checked out. I want to have it determined what it is. And Ray agreed to that. So they went to the next MUFON meeting there in El Paso, and they put out the word to everybody there. Who in the field of alternative knowledge talks about skulls? Who knows about skulls that we can approach with this? And my name came up because at that time in 99, I was touring the country talking about a book I had written called Everything You Know Is Wrong, which dealt with an alternative view of human origins and a lot to do with hominoids, Bigfoot, the abominable snowman, things like that, and also what are called prehumans. And I compared the prehuman skulls to what the hominoid skulls were supposed to look like, and my argument was that they were the same, that they were not prehumans, they were actually hominoids. So people who had seen me do that presentation told Ray and Melanie, Lloyd Pye does a lot about skulls in his presentation, so why don't you contact him? So they did, and they asked me to come by the next time I was in the El Paso area, and that was going to be in a couple of months, in February, mid-February of 99. And so I said, I'll be on my way to a big conference in Las Vegas, in Laughlin, Nevada, near Las Vegas, and I can swing by then. And they said, great, love to see you, we'll wait for you. So I went by and visited with them, and fully expecting I was going to see something relating to Bigfoot. They didn't say what it was, they just said, we'll show you when you get here. So I assumed it was going to be related to hominoids in some way. And when they pull these out of the box, it was quite a shock. It was absolutely the last thing I expected to see. And when they put the misshapen skull in my hands, I, just like Melanie, I knew enough about skulls to know this was very, very unusual, way too light, much too symmetrical. And I particularly understood the problems with the eye sockets because my father had been an optometrist for 40 years plus, and so I knew a lot about eyes, and I could see these were very otherworldly, unusual, weird eyes, but they were just perfect. I mean, just perfect, different but perfect, and that really didn't make sense to me. But even with all of that, my initial assessment was it has to be a deformity of some kind. It's the natural thing anybody would say when they first see something very, very unusual but has a general human look to it. Your first thought has to be it's a deformity. And if you don't know any better, that's what you're going to think. And Melanie knew better. It just so happened she knew better. I knew a little bit better, but the idea that I was holding an alien or a human alien hybrid in my hands was so difficult to accept, to wrap my mind around. I compare it to the shepherd that found the Dead Sea Scrolls and would have understood that, you know. It was on a par of unlikelihood with that, and I just didn't accept it. So I told them, I think it's probably going to be deformity of some kind or a combination of deformities, but I agree with you that it's very, very unusual, and I'm willing to undertake trying to find out what it is. And they said, well, how long do you think that will require? And I said, probably no more than a few months at the most. I'll take it out, I'll talk to experts, I'll find out, you know. They should be lining up when they see how weird it is. They should be lining up to try to figure out what it is, so it shouldn't be long. I would say 6 months maximum. And here I am talking to you today, a few months short of 12 years. So it's pretty clear that I had a very bad misconception of what I was going up against in terms of resistance to figuring out what this was. But at the time, I was not too worried. But then as I took it out in the beginning of '99 and began to take it to experts who would talk to me now, let's get clear on most of the people that I would contact would not talk to me. Because unfortunately, in the first week, that I had the skull, I took it to that conference that I was on my way to. It was the UFO Congress of Laughlin, Nevada, of February of 1999. And when I took it there, I showed it to a number of experts in the field of ufology. Now, at the time, I knew next to nothing about it. Ufology. I wasn't that interested in UFOs or aliens. I was interested in hominoids, human origins, the work of Zecharia Sitchin. That was my field. So I didn't really know what I was getting into, and I didn't really know much about this, what this might be relative to UFOs and aliens. But I knew that if I took it to that conference, there would be many, many top-notch experts there who could tell me a lot more about it, and they did. So I took it to them, and I showed it to them and to groups of them, and they were all very excited about it. They all agreed with Melanie that it probably was a gray alien. It had all the hallmarks, all the physical hallmarks that it needed, and it was so different from the human that I had there as a comparison, that everybody was really urging me, this really could be it. This really could be it. So the first thing we did that week was take it to a lab to be x-rayed. In a lab in Las Vegas, a friend named Mark Bean did that. And there they found that it had no frontal sinuses at all. No frontal sinuses at all. And they also found that in the maxilla, the little piece of maxilla that we had, which had 2 teeth down, it had 5 teeth, 5 crowns up here waiting to come down. So the radiologist said, this is really, really unusual, the lack of sinuses, because, look, there are no vestiges, there's no nubs, there's no attempt to grow sinuses here. They're not there. They're gone. And that's very unusual. People can be born without well-functioning sinuses or very small sinuses, but there's always some kind of a sign that they tried to grow, And then he said, as far as the maxilla goes, if you've got teeth down and you've got teeth up, that's a child of 5 or 6 or in that range. So when he came back, we got all excited about it, and we said, well, let's call it the Starchild. And so we did, Starchild, right out of the box. Big mistake, because that prejudiced scientists against it immediately. They would hear that word Starchild and run the other way, because it was presupposing an alien existence, and they cannot tolerate that. They can't have anything to do with that. So I was up against it, trying to convince people to talk to me about it. And at first, I began to just not say Starchild. I'd just say I'd have an unusual skull. What are you doing with a skull? Well, it came into my possession, and I'm trying to find out what it is, and there was always a lot of suspicion. But they would agree to talk to me, and if they would, some of them, as soon as they would see it, they would just show me the door. I don't want to talk about that. But every once in a while, I'd get one that would tell me what I wanted to know, or they'd tell me their expertise. But they would say, but you can't use my name. And every once in a while, every once in a blue moon, I'd find one that would let me use their name. So it was a hard slog at first. But by the end of the year, by the end of '99, I talked probably to 30 or more experts. And they had convinced me in talking about their various areas of expertise, which they would say, well, I can't explain mine, but surely the rest of it, it's a deformity of some kind. And they would most often say probably a cradle-boarded hydrocephalic. That's what I got consistently. Every once in a while I'd hear other things like cruzons or aperts or something like that. In the early days, I never heard progeria from anybody. Now it's a common thing for them to say, even though it's not any of those things. But at first it was mostly cradle-boarded hydrocephalic. Well, very quickly I learned and figured out that it couldn't be either cradle-boarded or hydrocephalic. So that led to some confrontations when people would say, oh, that's a cradle-boarded hydrocephalic, and I would begin to explain how that couldn't be. And scientists, for the most part, are not good at being told they're wrong by somebody who's, in their mind, much lower than them on the pecking order of intellectual ability. So, we had some problems with that. But by the end of the year, I had stacked up 25 major physiological differences between this skull and a human skull. And those 25 major differences stood for a lot of genetic difference in the Starchild and the human. It indicated, or it meant, that it had so many genetic instructions that were significantly different from human that it probably had a lot of genetic difference within its genome. But the problem was we couldn't get any help getting to that genome, because in 1999 there were only 6 labs in the world that could recover ancient DNA, and by then we had established through carbon-14 testing that it was 900 years old. So, knowing that, we had to go to an ancient DNA lab. We couldn't get any of those 6 labs to touch it with a 10-foot pole for any amount of money. Didn't matter. Starchild, alien, we don't want anything to do with it. So by the end of 99, I had convinced myself that it wasn't a human deformity, and I had stacked up all these physiological differences. But none of those physiological differences, either individually or all together, meant anything to science. Science fully refused to accept the possibility that this could be anything other than a deformity, and they did so by saying nature can do anything. That was the answer I kept hearing from everybody. Well, nature can do anything. Nature can do that. Nature can do anything you point out that's different. Nature can do that. Nature is all-powerful. It can produce any combination of defects it wants, and there's nothing you can say about it. And so I realized that I was hamstrung in proving anything against that answer, because it defeated everything. Only DNA, everybody said, show us some DNA that's not human and we'll be impressed. But showing us these physical features that aren't human, that doesn't impress us, because that's possible for nature to do. But nature can't fiddle with DNA. DNA is what it is. It's the math of biology. So show us some different DNA, we'll be impressed. And so that became sort of the task from the end of 99 forward. And because I couldn't get any of the 6 current labs in the world that could recover ancient DNA to consider it, I chose to go with a forensic lab, which was much less sophisticated, and it was a teaching lab at the University of British Columbia in Canada. And while they were not really capable of doing what we needed, they were designed to recover DNA less than 50 years old, not 900 years old. But the thinking was that since the skull had been buried in a mine tunnel for 900 years, that the DNA would be fairly fresh, that it would still be good, and it might be fresh enough to qualify as less than 50 years. That was the hope. And so they said, we will try to tell you if your nuclear DNA is viable, if it's there, if it's not degraded. And we don't think that it will be. If it was indeed in a mine tunnel, it should be well preserved, because a mine tunnel is like a climate-controlled storage locker. It keeps a steady temperature. There's no rain to leach minerals into the bone. There's no sun to bake it out and cause degradation. So it should really be in good shape. We should be able to do it. So I said, okay. So gave them the skull, said go to work. And they contaminated the first sample. Again, students, this is a student-run organization, so things are going to happen, and they weren't prepared to deal with something like this. Contaminated the first, contaminated the second, and in the third test, they got an answer, but it was a very weak and a very unreliable answer. They got what at that time was 200 picograms of a result that said it was a human male, an XY chromosome arrangement that said it was a human male. And I just had a feeling that it was probably another contamination, because 200 picograms is 1/5 of the minimum 1,000 picograms that you required for a reliable answer. So I was not satisfied with that, and I requested another run to make sure as a backup. And the next run came in the exact same thing. They said 200 picograms male XY, and I was very dissatisfied with that answer, notwithstanding the fact that it was saying that the Starchild was a human male and it was therefore a deformity and you could just forget about it and go home. I did not feel that the lab was acting in good faith with their results. I think they were just trying to get rid of us. I think they were having problems that they didn't want to admit to, problems that they didn't want to address openly. And so rather than try to do that, they just tried to get rid of us with the one answer that would do that, which is a human male, because it's over then. Go home, done. So at the end of 99, there was a collapse, an absolute collapse of interest in the Starchild, because the word went out from the lab that it was a human male, and a skeptic named Stephen Novella at the New England Skeptical Society, an organization that he founded and runs, wrote an article, a very scathing article about the Starchild and about me and everything that we were trying to do, saying that this was just a complete bust. It was a human, that was it. Everybody could just forget about it now and for always and never give it another thought, and that was it. And that bled over into the field of alternative knowledge. I could not get anybody to take it seriously. Nobody would invite me to speak about it. They would all just say, wasn't it proved human? And I would say, well, a lab said it was human, but that doesn't mean that it really was. I think they made a mistake. How would they make mistakes? They're scientists. How would they make mistakes? And I'd say, well, I think they did, and I don't think they told the truth. Well, why wouldn't they tell the truth? They're scientists, and it was incredibly hard to overcome that brainwashing that is common in the public, that science just doesn't make mistakes and doesn't have agendas and doesn't have emotional axis to grind, and all. They're human beings, and they have all the faults that the rest of us have, but their propaganda has brainwashed the public into believing that they are above those kinds of things, which they're not. So I was, for 3.5 years, I struggled very hard, well, 3 years, to get people to take a second look, and I just could not overcome that article. I couldn't overcome the articles, the negative articles about it. The Novella article spawned other articles, negative, that they used that as a reference, and it was hopeless. So in that time, I went very, very deeply in debt and just couldn't get it going. So at the end of 2002, around Christmas time, my girlfriend of the time just gave me an ultimatum, and she said, "You have got to stop this. You have got to quit. You've got to give it up. It's killing you. It's driving you down. It's wrecking our relationship. You need to stop." And so I had to agree that it had gotten out of control. So I put out the word to my mailing list that I was going to give it up as of January 1st, and I was going to return the skulls to Ray and Melanie, and they were just going to be able to do whatever with it and give it to anybody else they wanted or whatever, but I couldn't do anymore. I closed by saying I'm still convinced that it's not a typical human deformity, that lab made a mistake, but until I can get, until there's another test done on it, we're not going to know for sure. Within a few days, a woman named Belinda McKenzie in London contacted me and said that her father had died recently. She had come into an inheritance. She had some money now, and what would it cost to get that second DNA test, that confirming test, to know one way or the other for sure that she had followed my story for some time, and she wanted to know the answer, the real true answer, whatever it was. And that's really all I wanted, just a real true answer that we could believe in. So I didn't know where we stood at the time in terms of ancient DNA labs, but I went right to work. I said, I'll get you a number as soon as I know what it is. And so I found that there were 24 labs now in the world in 2003 that were able to do ancient DNA recovery. And so I took those labs and I started calling them, and I found one, Trace Genetics in California, that was willing to do the work, run by two young men named Rip and Molly and Jason Eshelman. And they just said, look, we'll do it. We don't care. We don't have a dog in the fight. It's just business to us. We'll, you pay your money, we'll tell you what it is. We'll get you a result, and you can count on it. We are a certified ancient DNA lab. We we worked on the Kennewick Man, we'll get you an answer, don't worry. I said, great, but I'm not going to turn the skull just over and walk away the way I did in Canada, because I got shafted that way. If you don't mind, I'm going to hang around and see what you do. And it's fine, stay as long as you want. No problem, we have nothing to hide here. My girlfriend and I brought the skulls to the lab and met them and talked to them, and we just found them to be delightful young men, and they were just absolutely dedicated to getting the answer, whatever it was. They didn't care up or down. They were going to do a good job. So we went in. They were prepared to do the cutting of the first bone samples out of it, the samples that they were going to use, and they were going to take pieces out of the parietal. Now, keep in mind that the Canadian lab had already taken several pieces off the Starchild, and only one piece off the human, because its DNA for the Canadian lab came up perfectly the first time as human, as a normal human nuclear DNA, easy to recover. But the 4 attempts for the Starchild, the 2 contaminations and the 2 claimed 200 weak response picograms, and so those 4 samples were gone. So they were going to cut a window, a square part out of the parietal right here, and they were going to cut a part out of the parietal here, because the Canadian lab had taken the condyles out of here. So when they set up, they cut with what's called a Dremel blade, and it looks kind of like a flashlight with a spike sticking out the end of it, and attached to that spike is a circular blade like this, about 1 inch wide, 1.25 inches maybe, and it spins very, very fast. When they turn that motor on, it's a high-speed, small rotary blade to cut through the bone. So what he did was, what Jason did, he's standing there with his coat and his protective glasses on, and he cuts through with 4 cuts. Zoom, 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 zoom. And a piece, 1 square inch, falls out, down, comes out the neck hole, and there it is. Then he cuts that square inch into 4 pieces, and those little 1/4 inch pieces are what they work with. Now, comes the Starchild's turn. Puts it up, locks it in the thing that braces it and all that, and he puts the Dremel blade down on it, whereas before it just went whoop, right in. He did that same thing, and he went whoop, boop, and when the blade hit the bone, it kind of bounced up and made kind of a boop sound. And, Jason looked over at Rip and like, what was that? And looked at me. I didn't know. But then I remembered that when I was talking to one of the Canadian guys, when they had worked on it years before, he had said, this bone is so hard, we could hardly get the tooth out. This bone is really hard. Well, at the time, that just flew right over my head. I didn't follow up on it like I should have. But now, we were seeing what that meant. This was really, you would think the Canadian lab would have made more to do about it, because they cut a lot of it, and they should have said more than just a kind of a passing thing. This is hard. But again, they were students. So they were like me. They didn't have enough experience to know. But Jason and Rippon had cut a lot of bone in their career, so they knew what they were looking at. So this time he really pressed hard, and he went, and boy, this time the bone powder had flown a little bit with here, and the smell of burning collagen, which is the smell you get when you drill your teeth, that distinctively bad odor, we got a little of that out of the human, a normal amount. With the Starchild, bone powder flew, and the stink was overwhelming. I mean, the stink of the burning collagen was unreal bad. But Jason was able to struggle through his 4 cuts. And when and you could already see from other cuts that the bone of the Starchild was a lot thinner. And it's about half as thin or less than human bone. It weighs half as much, that distinctive lightness to it. And it was turning out that the bone was 2 or 3 times as hard. It was hard, even though it was much thinner. So when he cut it out, we were just running for the windows and the door to get air into the room because of that stink and the powder that had thrown up. And he cut that 1 inch piece, same thing, fell out the neck hole, and he cut it into 4 pieces. And when it was all done, he said, look, this bone is very, very different than human bone. You really need to find out more about the bone itself. First time I'd heard that. He said, he gave me one of those little 1/4-inch pieces in a test tube, and he said, take this and find out what you can about it. Meanwhile, we're going to do the DNA that we told you about. Okay. So I ended up going to London for a year to stay with Belinda and use the help of English scientists to find out, many more things about the bone. But in the meanwhile, they were working on the DNA. Now, the way you do it, the way you recover it, or the way you did it then was, you took the human bone, you took the little chip, the little piece, and you put it in a test tube, and you put a liquid, you covered it in a liquid called EDTA. And EDTA, you take that test tube and you put it in what's called a rocker arm, which is a machine that does this for just 24/7. It never stops once you start it. So they put it in the rocker arm, in the EDTA, and a week later, human bone is reduced down to nothing. It's part of the liquid now. The EDTA has reduced it to liquid, and in there is the DNA, the strands of DNA, and that's when you begin the process of working with it. With the Starchild piece of bone, they put in the same kind of test tube, different one of course, but in another rocker arm, and in 1 week there was absolutely no change. 2 weeks, no change. A month, no change. 2 months. I think they let it run for 3 months before they just finally turned it off because it had not changed at all. Meanwhile, after a couple of weeks went by and they realized it wasn't working, they let me know, we have a detergent here, a very powerful detergent called Tween 20 that will dissolve stone. And we're going to put it in that and see what happens. And sure enough, one night in the rocker arm with Tween 20 and it was dissolved. The Starchild bone was dissolved. But it was like a rock, not like a human. So, again, this was more of, this bone is very unusual. You really need to find out about this bone. So, when they began the process of recovering the two things that they were able to recover, which is mitochondrial DNA and nuclear DNA. Now, it's important to understand the difference between those two things. In all of our cells, except our blood cells and brain cells, but in the normal cells of our body, we have the outer wall, and then there's a nucleus in here. Floating between the outer wall and the nucleus is what's called cytoplasm. And floating in the cytoplasm are little pieces that are called mitochondria, little power plants, mitochondria. And those are each about a little more than 16,000 base pairs long. But the mitochondria float in here, and there are a lot of them, about 16,000 base pairs each. Now, base pairs are what make up all of life everywhere is made up of 4 nucleotides that pair up into 2 base pairs. And these 2 base pairs, in combination, go out for millions and billions to make up genomes. The base pairs make up genes, genes make up chromosomes, chromosomes make up the entire genome of a living being, and that's in the nucleus of all of our cells. It's incredible how it works. But the basic unit, the basic brick, are these 4 nucleotides combined to make the base pairs, and everybody counts in terms of base pairs. So that's what I mean by 16,000 base pairs in the mitochondria. In the nucleus is all of the genome, the 23 chromosomes that come from your mother, the 23 chromosomes that come from your father. The mitochondria come only from your mother. So your mother contributes all of the mitochondria and half of the genome, half of what's in the nucleus. She contributes her 23 chromosomes. The male contributes his 23 chromosomes with no mitochondria from the male. So all of us have the mitochondria of our mothers, male or female, we have the mitochondria of our mothers, our grandmothers, our great-grandmothers, our great-great-grandmothers, our great-great-great-great-grandmothers, and right on back as far as you care to go. We have the female mitochondria because it comes down in the egg. Sperm carry no mitochondria. So we were looking for two things. We were looking for the mitochondrial DNA of both the human skull and the Starchild skull, and we were trying to determine the nuclear DNA of the human and the Starchild. This was key. Could we recover, and if we could, what did it tell us? So they went after the mitochondrial DNA of the human first, and the first attempt, easy recovery, bright and clear in the gel sheets, indicating very little degradation, which is what the Canadians had found when they recovered her nuclear DNA as well. First attempt, no problem. It's there, no real significant degradation. So what it came out as, the mitochondrial DNA, she was from haplogroup A. She, her mother, her grandmother, her great-grandmother, all from haplogroup A, which is a typical Mesoamerican group from Mexico. Absolutely nothing unusual about that. Now, they went after the Starchild's mitochondrial DNA. And when they did that, again, a very easy recovery, first attempt, and they found that its mother and its grandmother and great-grandmother and right on back had been from haplogroup C, another kind of Mesoamerican. Now, this told us a few significant things, one of which was the Starchild had a human mother. Otherwise, the mitochondrial DNA would not have connected, would not have shown up with the primers that were in use in 2003. Primers were long strings of human-made base pairs, strings made by humans of base pairs, a few thousand long. And they were like chemical keys, where you'd put them into the mix of the human only, you put them into human DNA, those keys find the locks that match up, and there's only a couple dozen of these keys, a couple dozen primers that they would use to tell them everything they needed to know. So they would lock up, and that would be it. So the mitochondrial locked up and showed that human haplogroup A, human haplogroup C. So the Starchild has a human mother. Also, we found out they were not related. Now, up until then, we had believed they were related. We had believed that it was probably a mother and a child, because the scene that the girl described of the death, the burial far away in an obscure mine tunnel, and then the suicide with the hand wrapped around the arm showing the emotional bond, the emotional connection, indicated to us mother and father. Plus, by then, we had been told about the Mesoamerican and ancient American legends called the star being legends, of star beings coming from the sky to find, now this is in ancient times, to find in a tribe a woman who was barren, who had no children or had no husband and no other children to take care of, and she would be made pregnant. And the beings would tell the village, let the village know, she's pregnant now, she's going to have an unusual child, you are all tasked with raising that child so she could focus on it, and then we'll come get it at 5 or 6 or 7 or 8. Now this background and story was told to me by a woman named Paula Gunn Allen, Dr. Paula Gunn Allen, who was a professor emeritus from UCLA, who was a Native American herself and had done a lot of research in this field. She was a sociology professor, I believe. And she contacted me early on and told me this whole story. And she said, I think your Starchild is in fact one of those star beings that somehow didn't get picked up. That's what I think. And it made sense to me, so I bought into it. The star being legends go back for hundreds of years, hundreds of years. I don't know thousands of years, but certainly hundreds of years. Enough to where they come down verbally within the tribes and the elders who she would communicate with about it, and not just in North America, but in South America as well. So very, very interesting stuff, the whole star being legend thing. So it made sense to us that it would be a mother and a child. But later we found out that it wasn't a child, but for a long time we did believe it was a child because of the teeth and the teeth situation. And then later somebody noticed that the teeth were fairly worn for a child. And then later when the Canadians pulled the root out, that root was awful big, but we still went with the idea of mother-child up until that 2003 DNA tests proved beyond a shadow of a doubt they were not genetically related. So whatever their relationship was, whether it was caretaker, whether it was lover, whether it was wife, we don't know. There's no way to know. But there was obviously a strong emotional link between them because she was willing to die in the way that she did. So we just have to take that on faith and wait for some kind of clarification if we can ever get one about what their relationship might have been. Certainly not mother and child. So now we're at the point where we have a mitochondrial recovery for both, and the Starchild has a human mother, and the recoveries are very easy. The DNA is good, fresh, clean, not going to have a problem here. So they do the nuclear DNA for the human. Again, first attempt, just like with the Canadian lab, no problem, recovery, human, nothing unusual about it. Now it's time for the first attempt at the recovery of the Starchild's nuclear DNA. And they inform me that we've got the human, both its mitochondrial and its nuclear have been easy to recover. We're not looking at a degraded specimen here. It's going to be a good result. And since we've got a human mother, you pretty much have to expect it's going to have a human father, and you need to prepare yourself for that answer. And I said, I don't care. I just want this over with. At that point, it had been 4 years out of my life, 4 years off the track of my other career in human origins and hominoids, and I was anxious to get back to it. All along the way of these 12 years, I've been anxious to get this over with and move back to that other persona that I would prefer to be. So anyway, we were at the point of doing the Starchild's nuclear DNA. They ran the first test, no result. Second test, no result. Third test, no result. 6 tests they ran to be sure. No result. It was clear at that point that the father was somehow preventing those keys from attaching, those primer keys from going in and finding the lock. The mother's there. We know the mother, the 23 chromosomes of the mother are there. If the Starchild had a human father, a normal human father, those keys would have gone in and hooked up, and that would have been it. It would have been over right then, and that would have been fine. It would have been the truth. We could all have said, well, that's the truth. That's what it is. These 25 physical deformities, it's 1 in a 10, 20 billion or whatever, but there it is. It's a human, and that would have been it. So after these 6 attempts, they were able to say conclusively, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the technology of the day, 203, could not recover the Starchild's nuclear DNA. Now, what did that mean? It meant that the technology of 2003 could not do it, so it for sure couldn't do it in 99. So what they had proved in 2003 was that the test in 1999 was absolutely invalid. Just more contamination or manipulation of results, or whatever you want to call it. The result from 99 was wrong. But Novella and all other scientists, all other skeptics, have totally ignored the 2003 test, which was much more valid, carried out in an ancient DNA lab by qualified ancient DNA geneticists, versus a forensic lab carried out by students who were not really qualified to do it. They choose to this day believe and support the first test over the second test. Because why? It gives them the answer they want. It gives mainstream science and critics and skeptics the answer they want, which is that this is just a human male, and that's it. When in fact it was proven wrong in 2003, and if they had had any kind of decency or pride or whatever in their work and their profession, they would have been willing to say, okay, we made a mistake and it's obvious that the new result is correct. But this is not what they want to hear, so they just pretend it didn't happen. But it did happen. And the report is there for anybody on the Starchild Project website to read. It's clear that it's there. And later, I should add as a sidebar, in 2006, I asked Novella to change the article, pull the article, update the article, do anything to it, because it was filled with wrong information now. And he wrote me back and he said the article will stand as written, and the only change that he made was to changed the copyright date from 1999 to 2006 so that this flawed report of his would seem more current. And to this day, it's still used as the basis of the Wikipedia, which I call Wakipedia, the Wakipedia report on me and the Starchild. So on my websites, the starchildproject.com and lloydpye.com, you can read the truth. You can read every line of the Wikipedia articles about me and about the Starchild on those two different websites. And under each line and each sentence and each phrase, I tell the truth for anybody that wants to see it. And same thing with the novella article. It's there, line for line, word for word, and I tell you what he says and then what the truth is. But again, people don't understand how science manipulates the truth